Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Cleveland Clinic CEO and President, Dr. Toby Cosgrove.
Well, I'm delighted to welcome you all here on this snowy afternoon. Thank you for braving it. We have a great individual here today. His first Earth Day was held on April 22nd, 1970. Mark Tercek was in the 7th grade. He and his Boy Scout troop observed the day by working in Cleveland's metro parks. They were caring for the land. Today, he does the same thing on a global scale. He is president and CEO of the Nature Conservancy. It is an organization that includes 550 scientists and $6 billion in assets. With 199 million acres of land in 30 countries, it oversees more conserved land than anyone on Earth. Growing up in Cleveland, Mark Tercek delivered newspapers and won the Plain Dealer Scholarship to Western Reserve Academy. He went on to graduate from one of the world's great colleges, Williams College, and earned his MBA degree at Harvard Business School. Between that, he traveled in Japan, studied martial arts, and took his first job with a bank. Goldman Sachs hired him in 1984, and he headed the business units, including the corporate finance, equity capital markets, consumer and healthcare, and leadership development. In 1996, he was made a partner. Goldman put him in charge of its new Center for Environmental Markets in 2005, with orders to find investments and opportunities in sustainable energy. He met his wife, Amy, in high school. They have 4 children. Mark says being a father helped him see the environment through new eyes of a new generation. When the opportunity arose, he led to lead the Nature Conservancy. He left Goldman. It was 2008, just before the crash. As CEO of the Nature Conservancy, he has built an innovative partnership with business and industry to protect nature's capital. Today, the Conservancy has more than 5 million dues-paying members. It is the largest nonprofit environmental group in the Western Hemisphere. Mark Tercek is a yoga enthusiast, a vegan, and a dedicated marathoner. He recently told Forbes that he wrote a whole chapter of a book, Nature's Future, on his BlackBerry. He is a member of the Commission on Climate and Tropical Forests and the Council on Foreign Relations Climate Change Task Force. He serves as an adjunct professor of finance at New York University's Stern School of Business. In 2010, he was appointed by the U.S. Secretary of Energy to serve on the National Petroleum Council. And he is a trustee of Western Reserve Academy. Outside Magazine named him as one of the 25 most influential people in the world outside. Please watch this video.
But there is hope for what remains.
You should think about nature as infrastructure, something to invest in, to improve economies, to improve jobs, to improve life.
Conserving the lands and waters on which all life depends is the mission of the world's largest conservation group and the vision and passion of the man who leads it. Mark Tercek grew up in Cleveland, Ohio.
Part of my business career where I learned everything I know happened here in Cleveland. I was a paperboy for the Cleveland Plain Dealer.
He graduated from Williams College and earned his MBA from Harvard and became an investment banker at Goldman Sachs.
As a business person, I became very interested in business being a force for good, and in this case, especially the environment.
In 2008, after 24 years on Wall Street, Mark Tercek made a bold career move.
My next guest went from making green at Goldman Sachs to going green.
Inspired by the opportunity to build new alliances for nature, coupled with his passion for the environment, he became president and CEO of the Nature Conservancy.
What you have brought to the table here is a partnership between business and an environmental group.
Mark Tercek's dedication to nature, combined with his business savvy, is helping the Nature Conservancy catalyze changes in public policy and corporate practices.
We'll invest $10 million into these efforts, a sound investment, one that will bring real returns to our company and to our world.
And his best-selling book, Nature's Fortune, has captured public attention as well.
His book provides all of us with a vital lesson about how natural assets that are oft neglected are actually our world's most enduring and most valuable assets.
Under Mark Tercek's leadership, the Nature Conservancy thrives, with a reach that encompasses all 50 states and 35 countries, protecting 119 million acres of land, preserving thousands of miles of rivers, and operating more than 100 marine conservation projects globally. A man committed to protecting nature and preserving life, now and for generations to come.
Please welcome back to Cleveland, Mark Tercek.
Thanks, Toby. Thank you very much, Dr. Cosgrove, and to your great team here at the Cleveland Clinic. It's really a thrill for me to be here. Thanks to all of you for braving the bad weather as well. It's nice to see you. And wow, thanks for that video. I've got to get a copy of that. My kids will be impressed. Anyway, you heard a little bit about me. I didn't even remember all of that stuff. Anyway, part of the introduction was how I worked for Goldman Sachs for 24 years. And in 2008, I was appointed the head of the Nature Conservancy. And at that time, I thought, what better place for the Nature Conservancy to find their next CEO than Wall Street? But it turns out that's not how everybody saw it. And that was particularly true in the environmental field, it seems, even at TNC. But I remember one event in particular, and I tell this little story in the beginning of my book. It was the early days. I was in my new career as the head of TNC in Washington, D.C., and I was at this fancy environmental event, and it was kind of a who's who of environmental leaders. My counterparts were all there, the CEOs of the other leading environmental organizations. Our elected officials who care about the environment, so those congressmen and congresswomen and senators with a special focus on the environment were there. Cabinet members like the Secretary of Agriculture and Interior were there. And the foundation heads, the big foundations that fund us, were there. And so as the new guy from Wall Street, it was a little bit intimidating. And there was one individual in particular who really stood out. An older gentleman. In fact, it looked like he was in his 90s, although very fit and vigorous. And I could see that everybody was paying special deferential respect to this man. And it dawned on me, it must have been Russell Train. And all of you won't know Russell Train, but some of you will, because he was a giant in the environmental field. He passed away a little bit more than a year ago now in his 90s. But Russell Train was, for example, the founder of the World Wildlife Fund, a founder of the Conservation Fund, the second head of the Environmental Protection Agency, the first chairman of the President's Council on Environmental Quality. I could go on and on. It's amazing what he accomplished in his long life focused on the environment. So I thought, well, as the new head of TNC, I better go over and introduce myself. So I did that, a little sheepishly, and I explained to Mr. Train who I was and where I came from, and he wasn't impressed. In fact, he kind of stood to the side, looked me up and down, looked me in the eye, and said, rather gruffly but not unkindly, "How the hell did you get from Goldman Sachs to leading the Nature Conservancy?" Well, I fumbled for an answer, but I'm going to tell you tonight what I should have told Mr. Train at the time. I want to make 3 points and then give you a few examples. The first thing I should have said, I think, to Mr. Train was, as great as the environmental movement has been, It's also appropriate for environmental organizations to consider new strategies, new kinds of leaders, indeed, even people like me. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but it's a time where the environmental movement, I think, needs to be open to new approaches. The second thing I should have said is, when we think about those new approaches and strategies, in particular, we should be looking for ones that will get more people on our side, bring us more resources, and allow for environmentalists and the rest of society to have a better, more productive dialogue. And then the third thing I should have said, and it's what I write about in my book, and it won't surprise you, coming from a former investment banker, I think an invest in nature approach can do that. I think that can be a strategy that can really allow for a lot of environmental progress. So let me talk about each of those three things. I'll give you a couple of examples, and then I'll try not to go on too long. We can open it up for questions and answers or challenges. That'll make it, I think, livelier and more interesting for all of us. So first, point one, what about the environmental movement? Well, at my entire adult life, I admired environmental organizations. In my own way, I tried to financially support them, and I knew them pretty well. And today, I know them very well. Obviously, I know the Nature Conservancy extremely well. The video kind of alluded to it. We're a formidable organization. I couldn't be more proud of our history, my staff, great staff, our passionate supporters and donors. We're accomplishing a lot. We've accomplished an amazing amount over our 62-year history. But I could also speak very positively about all of the other leading environmental organizations. And likewise, I could heap praise on our partners in government and business. And I could regale you with stories of tremendous things we've accomplished in the environmental space. We have a lot to be proud of. I'm sure lots of you are connected to the environmental movement, support environmental organizations. Thank you. We all have a lot to be proud of. However, at TNC, we pride ourselves on being science-driven. So, however, if you're science-driven, you've got to look at the facts. And the facts tell us, we environmentalists aren't really getting the job done. You could say that we're winning lots of battles, but perhaps we're losing the war. Now, why do I say that? Imagine if you had my job. You were the CEO of TNC. Think of the things that you would want to see more of. We describe our mission as saving the lands and waters that life depends on. So if you were in my spot and you wanted to monitor how we were doing, you would track things, and we do track these things. You'd probably want to see more healthy forests, more healthy and robust fisheries, coral reefs, grasslands, rainforests, biodiversity itself. Well, we track all of those barometers, and sadly, they're all in decline. Or we could think about it the other way. We could think about what we would like to see less of. Take, for example, greenhouse gases that cause climate change. We'd like to see less of those emissions, but notwithstanding everybody's great efforts, every year we set a new record high of emissions. So we have to acknowledge, even though we're doing a lot of good, we're not really getting the job done. And by the way, when we look forward, it's only going to get more difficult. We know the world's population will grow from something like today's 7 billion people to 9, maybe even 10 billion people by 2050. Let's hope it's a lower number. But more significant than the growth of population is the growth of the world's middle class. The world's middle class is growing at an even faster rate. Now, at TNC, we think that's a good thing. We think it's a good thing that people are being lifted out of poverty. That's not just a nice thing to say. That means families will have access to better food and nutrition, better education, and energy. These are important things. But it also means as billions of people rise into the consuming middle class, that means there'll be more demand for food, space, energy, water. And with that will go a tremendous amount of built infrastructure. And all of that is a threat to our mission, saving lands and waters. And if that's not enough for you, you have to throw on top of that the impact of a changing climate. So somehow, environmentalists have to build on our past success and find a way to get more done faster and at bigger scale. I'm cautiously optimistic we can do that, but to do that, we have to be open to new strategies, new approaches, new partnerships. And so that's what I should have said. First, I should have said to Mr. Train, it's not so crazy that TNC would choose someone, say, in my case, from the business community to bring new approaches, because we need to be trying new approaches. And we should all be relatively humble about our own approach. Let's see what will work best. So that's part one. Even though the environmental movement is a great one, and I couldn't be more proud to be a leader of an important organization in the space, we also have to acknowledge that we've got to get more done. We've got to be more effective. Now, what do we need in particular? I wouldn't say that the strategy I argue in my book is the only one or necessarily the best one. Rather, I just say it's one of the strategies that I think we should try, and I think it's going to accomplish a lot for us. Now, the strategy in particular that I argue for in the book is investing in nature. And what I mean by that, and examples will help, is think of nature as a capital stock, an asset base that does good things for people. What kinds of things does nature do for people? Well, it produces the clean air you breathe every day. It provides the water and food that you drink and eat. It provides protection from storms and floods. It provides the stable climate that we need for our continued existence. You know, it's hard to be against any of that. And if you think of nature as capital, let's call it green infrastructure, as opposed to gray infrastructure, I think that kind of approach, especially if we get ever more precise about it, will suggest that we can make investments in nature that are very good deals. They provide big investment returns. They save us money. That's what I argue about in the book, and in the book we have many examples that I think are very compelling and suggest this strategy really can work. So that's the second thing I should have said to Mr. Train. It's not so crazy to have an investment banker, because not only might he bring new strategies in general, he might bring a kind of investment banker approach to nature that really has some merit. That's what I write about in my book. And the third thing I should have observed is, by the way, this strategy, and I think any good strategy for environmentalists, should do at least three things. One, we need to get more people on our side. Sometimes environmentalists, I think, don't get this quite right. We love nature. We think we owe our kids and our grandkids a natural world as healthy as the one we've enjoyed. We think that's just the morally right thing to do. That's enough to motivate the team at TNC. That's enough to motivate our core supporters. But there's a problem. You know, not enough people in the world think that way. In fact, some people, I believe, when they hear us talk about nature that way, they think of nature almost as a luxury good, something that's nice to invest in or take care of if you have extra resources, something that the rich should feel free to take care of voluntarily if they want, but if times are hard or if a country is poorer, they can't rationalize investments in nature. I think that's exactly wrong. In fact, I think it's vulnerable people who really depend on nature. And so one approach, our invest in nature approach one benefit of the investment in nature approach can be, I think, getting more people on our side. Not thinking of nature as something for the well-to-do to worry about, but something that we all have a stake in. The second thing we need is more financial resources invested in nature. If I'm right, that it's this great investment opportunity, then we should be investing more resources in it. To date, most of the environmental progress that we've achieved has been done on a philanthropic model. We're lucky, we folks with jobs like mine. There are a lot of people who care about nature so much that they make voluntary donations to us and other organizations. And that's allowed the movement to become very successful and to get a tremendous amount accomplished. But I think we need more resources on our side. We need approaches that go beyond philanthropy. Again, I think an investment approach can do that. And I'll give you some examples to help you see where I'm coming from. And then the third thing I think any good strategy should do is improve the dialogue between environmentalists and everybody else. Too often environmentalists make the mistake, and I've made the mistake, of kind of hectoring people, telling them what they should do and what they shouldn't do, kind of being a scold. Now, we do this with good intentions. You know, we think we know what we're doing, and we might even have a point, but guess what? People don't want to be lectured at by me. And it's led to a lot of divisiveness. Sometimes this approach even leads to vilification, bad feelings, and I just don't see a lot of good things coming from that kind of rancorous debate. To be sure, there are some bad actors out there, and we should go after them, but I think environmentalists have overdone that. But alternatively, if we think about nature as an investment opportunity, if we think about investing in nature in order to solve problems or get things done, the dialogue becomes very different. Instead, it becomes one where the environmentalists quiet down, listen to other people, understand what they're trying to accomplish, and then the different parties roll up their sleeves and work together to make important things happen. So, if I had really been quick on my feet, that's what I would have said to Mr. Train. It's a time for new strategies. The invest in nature is a worthy one, and if we do it right, it'll get us more people, more resources, and a better dialogue with society. But that all sounds like happy talk, so let me give you one or two good examples. The first example takes place in Quito, Ecuador, the capital city of Ecuador. If any of you should ever go visit the Galapagos, you'll probably travel through Quito. It's a very nice city. It's a booming city. It's growing very fast. And 6 or 7 years ago, the municipal water company of Quito, was a government agency, was concerned about whether it would have enough clean water for its fast-growing population. And so the water company was planning additional investment, sizable additional investment in plant and equipment to clean water. The local Nature Conservancy team knocked on their door with a very good alternative idea. And they made a business case or an economic case, not an environmental case. My colleagues argued to the Quito Water Authority, instead of building plant and equipment to clean water, instead invest in your upstream watershed. That will be a lower cost, more effective way to secure the clean water you need, and you'll save money. Why not? So the water company said, that sounds very interesting. Let's try. So TNC contributed a little bit of money, very little to be honest. The water company contributed a little of money. And with that money, we went upstream to the watershed and we worked with local communities to change ranching and farming practices in order to keep the water clean. And we knew how to do this at the Nature Conservancy, we thought. We did things like working with the communities. We put fences to keep cattle away from the river. We had better ditching to keep fertilizer from running into the river. We did plantings along the river shore to prevent sedimentation. These kinds of initiatives. They seemed to work well. So then we recruited the local Coca-Cola bottler and the local brewer. Obviously, they depend on a clean water supply. They gave us some more funding. And with that funding, we went back upstream and did more work with local communities. And we had to do that carefully. We had to win the support of the local communities. We had to make sure it made sense for them, otherwise they wouldn't do it. And it seemed to continue to work even better. So then the water company got the authority to put in everyone's water bill a little fee for conservation. So now if you live in Quito and you get your water bill, you get your normal water bill, and then there's an extra charge for protecting nature. Now, of course, that extra charge would have been even higher if the plant and equipment had been built. That costs even more money. But instead, a smaller amount of money is being charged, and it's very explicit. It's for conservation. That's around the time I joined TNC. And of course, I had a financial background. I was trained in stretching money. And I thought this project was almost too good to be true. For a very little bit of money, philanthropic money up front, you can think of that almost as venture capital. For a little bit of an investment, we got the flywheel turning, and 3 great things happened. First of all, we got more people on our side, right? That's what I said we needed. Well, today, everyone who lives in Quito and pays a water bill, i.e. everybody, is supporting conservation because it's in their water bill. Second, I said we need more financial resources. Well, again, we're way past philanthropy. Philanthropy got this started, but now we have conservation that pays for itself. If we don't screw this up, it will work in perpetuity. People investing in nature because it's a good deal. They're saving money. And third, we get this better dialogue that I was talking about. That upstream watershed, this is an important fact. I forgot to mention it. The upstream watershed in Quito is the Bio-Condor Reserve of Ecuador. We TNC people, we would have wanted to protect it just to protect nature. But imagine if we had come to Quito and started scolding people and lecturing them and saying, you should be protecting your environment better in order to protect the habitat of the condors. Some people probably would have been sympathetic, but we would have been unlikely to win everyone's support. But we didn't do that. Instead, we rolled up our sleeves and said, let's see. You want clean water? We think investments in nature can produce that. Let's work together to make that happen. So more people, more financial resources, a better dialogue, conservation that pays for itself, and we get for free all the environmental benefits of protecting this upstream watershed. Incredible story, I thought. Then you might say, it's actually not that hard in the environmental movement, and probably in most nonprofit movements, to have these one-off victories. But the holy grail is to have replication or to achieve scale somehow so that you can really have an impact. So at this point, we liked this project so much, and I couldn't have been more enthused. I said, we should replicate this. So the Nature Conservancy raised $5 million of philanthropic money. The Inter-American Development Bank came up with $5 million. The Inter-American Development Bank is kind of a World Bank unit organization that focuses on Latin America for economic development. So they put up 5. And then FEMSA, which is the dominant Coca-Cola bottler across Latin America, obviously keenly interested in protecting watersheds, they put up 5. So now we have $15 million of philanthropic money. $15 million sounds like a lot of money, but really it's not that much in the environmental space. And with that money, we went about replicating these water funds. And we now have about 30 of these water funds across Latin America. They're each a little bit different, but in each case, you have downstream users of water paying for upstream conservation because it's a good economic deal. Investing in green infrastructure really works. It saves them money. And the environmental benefits are extras, but significant. For example, I was in Monterrey, Mexico, a couple of times this summer. Monterrey is kind of the Chicago of Mexico, or it's a Cleveland kind of town, the old Cleveland. It's a manufacturing industry town. And Monterrey has a different water challenge than Quito. Monterrey, it's sad really. They have the problem of too much water during the rainy season and too little water during the dry season. They have bad floods and bad droughts. And our hypothesis is that's because they've had severe deforestation. So the business leaders, the industrial leaders of Monterrey have come together, working with TNC, working with the local Monterrey Tech. It's kind of the MIT of Mexico, is in Monterrey. And we've raised $25 million in this case to restore forests and to do some other things. Because that forest, when restored, will kind of act like a sponge. I mean, nature's an amazing resource. And during the floods, forest as a sponge will absorb those waters. They won't rush into the city and flood. And then during the dry season, the forest will release that water, and so we'll fix the problems of too little water and too much. And I could go on and on. In Colombia, we have a project like this with Colombian sugarcane growers. I don't know if any of you have ever met Colombian sugarcane growers. I've had the pleasure to do so. They're great people. They tend to be men. They're kind of gruff guys who are sugarcane growers. They're nobody's definition of tree huggers, tree-hugging environmentalists. But they know they need clean water. And we showed them that they could invest in protecting their watersheds, and their sugarcane growing operations would be much more robust as a result. And so they're now great partners of ours. So we have 30 of these now, each time doing the same thing. Users of water, paying for nature, more people, more money, and a better dialogue. You could still say about these water funds, though, they're all kind of small, and they are a little bit small. The Monterey one is the biggest one. But now we're talking to the water authorities of Sao Paulo. And if you visit Sao Paulo, I mean, cities don't become bigger or more booming. And if you should ever fly from Rio to Sao Paulo and look out your window, you'll fly over the famous Atlantic Forest. Now, I never really knew much about the Atlantic Forest before I joined TNC. But as soon as I joined, I always heard stories about the sad environmental degradation of the Atlantic Forest. It was once one of this hemisphere's great forests, and over time, it has been degraded, mostly through kind of ill-conceived ranching operations. And if you look out the window, you'll see that. But it also happened, and environmentalists it's like a holy grail. We've wanted to restore the Atlantic forest. Well, it also happens the Atlantic forest is the watershed for the booming city of Sao Paulo. So Sao Paulo every year spends enormous sums of money investing in plant and equipment to secure the ever-growing need for clean water for the citizens of Sao Paulo. We're now talking to that water authority for Sao Paulo, and the hypothesis is the following. Can we shift some of their annual budget from gray equipment, plant and equipment, to green infrastructure, restoring the Atlantic forests? And by doing so, save money for the city in securing clean water that get all of the environmental benefits that will come from restoring this great forest. habitat for wildlife, sequestration of carbon, preserving traditional community livelihoods, opportunities for recreation in the great outdoors. If so, this will be a huge breakthrough. That's why I get excited about this invest in nature idea. Can't address every single environmental challenge, but boy, can it address a lot, in my humble opinion. In the book, I talk about examples in agriculture, in city situations, with regard to fisheries. You name it, investing in nature can do a lot. Now, let me give you one other example, and then we'll turn to questions and answers. So the other example is in our work with big business. So I'll admit a bias. When I joined the Nature Conservancy, I had the hypothesis that we could get more done by partnering with business. I was a businessman for 25 years. I was one of those business people who believed business could do two things at once. Do a good job for their shareholders and also do a good job for society writ large. And I thought that was really true in the environmental space. So then I joined the Nature Conservancy, and we're pushing this natural capital concept. And Andrew Liveris, who's the CEO of Dow Chemical, hears me. Actually, there was a clip of him in that video. I didn't know Andrew in my investment banking days, but I think he's really a great CEO. He focuses on the short-term issues, just like a good CEO should, but he also remembers the long haul. And he remembers, he knows that Dow's got a whole host of environmental issues and challenges, and a good CEO will be in the thick of it. So Andrew said to me, Mark, if it's true that society and business and the economy depends on natural capital, that must be true for Dow Chemical too. So let's do a project together. Let's do a project whereby we determine to what degree Dow depends on natural capital. What would it look like if you accounted for that and put it on your books like you do with man-made capital? How much does Dow depend on nature? And if so, is the nature that Dow depends on, is it vulnerable to environmental degradation? And by the way, the answer, of course, is it is. And if the natural capital Dow depends on is vulnerable, what might they do about it? So that's the project. We persuade Dow to understand that you can't do something like this overnight. So we design a 5-year project that's adequately funded so we can have all the science resources we need to really do this right. So we announce it with some fanfare. And so we announce it, and then immediately the criticism is almost overwhelming. And the criticism tends to go like this, from even people who are good friends of mine. Mark, have you lost your mind? Are you aware of Dow's environmental footprint? And my answer was, yes, exactly. I'm fully aware of Dow's environmental footprint. And if we can show a company like Dow that it makes business sense to take better care of nature, that's a new tool to really scale up environmental protection. Then some folks said, oh, you're being naive. I worked at Goldman Sachs a long time. We were called lots of things, but nobody ever called us naive. That was the first range of criticism. Then there was a second wave of criticism. This time it was a little bit different. This time the critics were more from the academic communities, and they said, Mark, this isn't a new idea, natural capital, and it's not a new idea. In my book, I was very careful to note the great academic leaders who have been writing about natural capital for some 10 years or more. Some of them are dear friends of mine, and they're important intellectual thought leaders. But it's writing about nature or natural capital or investments in nature, writing about that in kind of an academic way is very, very different from doing something about it. And so that's what we're trying to do in this Dow project. And the project has just been, the more we've been at it, the more interesting it gets, and the more it encourages me to think we're really onto something in terms of breakthroughs to scale up environmental progress. So the project's getting underway. We know we have critics. We know we need to be careful. So I very carefully pick a team of great scientists. Andrew picks a great team of Dow engineers. We send them down to Freeport, Texas, where Dow's biggest facility is. It's one of the biggest manufacturing facilities of any kind in the world. So they go down there to brainstorm for a few days, and then the meeting's over. I call up Andrew and I say, hey, what did you hear about the meeting? How did it go? And Andrew says, oh, Mark, I don't know that it was such a good meeting. My engineers tell me your scientists are kind of arrogant, and they're not that interested in paying attention to the realities of running a business. I said, oh, interesting. So I call my scientists. I say, what did you think of the meeting? And they say, Mark, we're not sure we want to work on this project. Those Dow engineers don't think like we do. In fact, some of them had the gall to tell us they weren't even sure they believed in climate change. So I said, oh, this project's going to be more interesting than I thought. At TNC, we actually changed our team a little bit. A few of our folks were just a little too rigid and set in their ways. But we adjusted our teams. We sent everybody back to work. That's where it's good to be CEO. I said, nope, get back to work. And folks got to know one another. And then things only got ever more interesting. I will admit now, when we originally designed this project, I was naive. I had the idea, the notion kind of that TNC would come down off the mountaintop and show Dow the enlightened path forward. But it hasn't been that way at all. We've learned probably more from the Dow engineers than they've learned from us. So one of our hypotheses going into this project was that Dow must be concerned about sea level rise and extreme weather, being there right at the shore, Freeport, Texas, right in the Gulf. So our scientists said to the Dow engineers, are you concerned about sea level rise and extreme weather? And the engineers absolutely were. Some of them might not have wanted to attribute that extreme weather to climate change, but they're engineers, they pay attention to the data, and they said, we get it, weather seems to be changing, we've got to protect this plant, that's our job. So our scientists said, how are you going to do that? And they said, we're planning investments in seawalls. And those Dow engineers knew everything, they know everything there is to know about seawalls. They know what they will do and what they won't do. They know what they'll cost, they know the useful life of a seawall, they know where they're vulnerable and where they're not. They've got it down to a science, as they should. Big responsibility protecting that plant. So then our scientists said, kind of like the team in Quito, they said, we think we have a better idea. Restore the coastal ecosystems that were once here. Restoring those coastal ecosystems will provide even more robust protection from storms and sea level rise. Further, they'll cost less money, and they won't depreciate. They'll hold their value. And on top of that, there'll be environmental benefits and co-benefits, community benefits. And so the Dow engineers said, wow, that sounds great. Please show us the data. And then our guy said, oh, data? How about this white paper? But that's what you learn by mixing it up in these kinds of collaborations. So now our scientists and the Dow engineers are hard at work testing the hypothesis that green infrastructure might outperform gray. We'll find out if it does or it doesn't in this case. If it does, great, because then Dow will do it and so will others. And if it doesn't outperform, we'll acknowledge that as well. And we're doing all this in jointly authored articles that we submit to peer-reviewed journals so that no one will be under any false impression that this is greenwashing or a PR exercise or anything like that. We really want to have the most robust case we can make. If critics find flaws in it, that'll be good to know because we'll go back to work. Because if we're right, we want this, again, to be replicated and to scale up. Then you learn in these projects, too, there's breakthroughs you would never anticipate. Just because our two teams were hanging around together there in Texas, we learned, we never knew this, because the plant's being expanded, Dow is required to put new scrubbers in their chimneys to deal with local ozone issues. And folks at the Cleveland Clinic will know that ozone pollution is becoming a really big health issue in the United States. So Dow is going to install these scrubbers in chimneys. It's hard for anybody to get excited about a scrubber in a chimney. And our scientists had another good idea. They said, you know, we think local reforestation will also address this ozone issue. It might do so at lower cost, and boy, there'll be a whole bunch of co-benefits that go with it. So as we speak, Dow and TNC are in front of the EPA, seeing where the EPA would bless this alternative approach. And again, I just read it. We've got academic journal articles now with all the data being submitted to journals for the very tough review process. Because if we're right about this, we'd really want it to be replicated. TNC would never have thought of this by themselves. Dow would never have thought of it by themselves. It'll be amazing if it happens. Dow will save money. There'll be massive reforestation in the Gulf. And it might even be, because of the way the wind blows, that some of the reforestation can occur in Houston. Now, Houston's a very nice city. All of you who have visited, I'm sure, will agree. But let's face it, Houston could use some more trees. And as the climate changes, those trees will lower temperatures, beautify the city. There'll be all these benefits, sequester carbon, et cetera. So again, you'll see in my long Dow example, and we have a bunch of other experiments with unlikely partners, you see, again, more people on our side, more financial resources, and a much healthier dialogue, I think, between environmentalists and other parties. We're not vilifying or criticizing anyone. We're not pretending to have all the answers. Instead, we're saying, let's take what we know, and we think we know a lot, and let's take what you know, and let's see if we can solve some problems together on a win-win basis. And I say, shouldn't we do that as much as possible and everywhere we can? That's what my book is about. That's what I should have said to Mr. Train. But I would have ended with Mr. Train. I would have said, though, one other thing in closing. We know at the Nature Conservancy, it's not all about dollars and cents. It's not all about this business approach. Again, we're people who believe in protecting nature for protecting nature's sake. We'll do that with all our gusto as much as we can, and that strategy alone will get a lot done. But the challenges we face are big ones. And we don't think that traditional approach will address all of our challenge. And so if we can add to the mix by using the kinds of strategies I've talked about tonight, and I write about at great length in the book, I say, let's go for it. And the more we do it, the more we're learning that there's all these unexpected breakthroughs that come when you stop fighting and start working together. Thanks for letting me talk for a little bit. You're really nice to listen to me. And now it's time for questions. Okay, so anybody with a question, we have mics someplace around here. Thanks. Oh, we have our first question. Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Having traveled the world with the Nature Conservancy, what regions or countries have you found are in the need of the most support for efforts towards the natural resources? And what is the Nature Conservancy doing to help those areas?
Okay, thanks. Yes, we're a global organization. We work in 35 countries. We don't work everywhere, though. Although we're a big environmental nonprofit, you can be big and under-resourced. And so we have to pick our spots very carefully. And so we don't answer the question exactly as you put it. We say, okay, even though we're big, we still have limited resources, so where can we make the biggest difference through our actions and hopefully have them replicated elsewhere? So I would say the countries where we have the most pronounced effort, this is a little bit informal, but it's approximately right, are China, Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, and across Africa. And each for different reasons, but take China, for example. Obviously, if you take a forward-looking perspective, China, first in its own country, but then China's going to be the biggest economy in the world soon. So not through their activities at home and their activities around the world as investors, figuring out how to help China do the best it can on this front is, one of our highest priorities. We're quite encouraged. I was speaking in a private meeting earlier about China, and it's like everything in our space, it's complicated. On the one hand, there's a lot to worry about in China. On the other hand, though, the people running China are mostly trained as engineers and scientists. They get the stakes, and we think they're going to be increasingly good partners of ours doing the right thing. So China is very important. Indonesia, sort of the same neighborhood. It's a big neighborhood. Indonesia still has some of the world's most important rainforests, as does Brazil and the Amazon. So we think it's really important to save those rainforests. They're stores of biodiversity. Those forests sequester carbon. They're important for the hydrological cycle, our rain supply. The strategies there are Brazil and Indonesia. They both need to economically develop. We get that. We're not fighting that. But take Brazil. The biggest threats to the forest in Brazil are soy farming and cattle ranching. And we think, already in soy we've had great success, now we're focused more on cattle. I talk about this in the book. If we can direct the expansion of those activities to be more on already degraded land rather than the healthy, pristine forest, it's a win-win for Brazil, better economics, and they save their rainforest. So those kinds of initiatives. Africa, finally, is a different example. Africa is the place where the pure nature lover there's the most to protect and save. Obviously, they're poor countries, lots of challenges, but we think, in fact, again, there's lots of opportunity for this win-win approach to make progress. So those are some of our thoughts. Thanks. Okay, now we turn here. Yes, sir.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for being here. I'm also a native Clevelander, and I think we've done some pretty nice things here recently, but I just wonder, from your perspective, what are some of the other things we can do locally here to improve the environment?
I'm embarrassed. I'm a proud Clevelander, but I'm not as close to the action as I should be. Josh Knights is here somewhere in the room. Josh Knights is here. You might want to grab him afterwards. He leads our Ohio chapter. But broadly speaking, I'm a city boy by background, proud Collinwood resident in my youth. And so when I joined TNC, I did push the organization. Shouldn't we be doing more in cities for a bunch of reasons? And there's a lot of exciting stuff happening in cities. And there are a lot of good environmental organizations doing this. In fact, the Nature Conservancy is a little bit of a newcomer. But where to start? Again, I mentioned Sao Paulo. New York City already is in the business of saving its watersheds, protecting nature for water supply. There's a lot of that opportunity in cities. Cities, for better or worse, are to some large degree located on coasts. So just like that Dow plant is concerned about sea level rise and extreme weather, so do cities now know that. Witness Hurricane Sandy. I was part of Governor Cuomo's task force on Sandy. So investments in coastal ecosystems to protect cities from risk is a big deal. Cities, I bet this is the case in Cleveland, I don't know that, but most older cities have badly out-of-date sewage systems. I talk about this in the book. When there's extreme weather, the sewage systems overflow, raw sewage is dumped, I'm sure, in Lake Erie. It's a terrible problem, but we're proving that if you make a city more like a forest, have more parks, more green roofs, more permeable surfaces, the city can absorb that intense weather, like we're trying to do in Monterey, and you'll reduce the pressure on your sewage system and get all the co-benefits that go with nature. So a range of initiatives like this are underway, and my hunch is they all apply in Cleveland. TNC is doing one other thing. I'm really proud that we're doing it. It's a tall order, but our chapters, all our Great Lakes state chapters and the Canadian province counterparts have come together in a very carefully organized way, led by Governor Snyder right now in Michigan, to restore and protect the Great Lakes, which we're excited about. So those are some examples. Thanks. Yes, ma'am.
I'm wondering, as you come back to Cleveland, what are the biggest changes that you see here, other than the fact that the plain dealer's not delivered daily anymore?
Sentimental question. Yeah, I'm really proud of Cleveland. It's a great place to be from. I had a great childhood here, and I wish I came more often. You know, you drive around Cleveland, the city looks so different, I can't believe it. These facilities weren't here. I sort of got lost coming here today. But I'm proud to see the city, broadly speaking, seems to be hanging in there and doing pretty well. You know, I've served on the board of Western Reserve Academy, and so paid attention to Cleveland from that perspective. And you know, congratulations through all the ups and downs and challenges the city's had over my lifetime. The good people of Cleveland have seemed to figure out a smart path forward. So keep up the good work. I think the biggest challenge from my vantage point is the one-loss record of your various professional sports teams, but I won't go there. Thanks for asking. Yes?
Hi. As a college student, one movement that has been gaining increasing steam is the divestment movement, where college students ask Board of Trustees and endowments to divest themselves of investments in fossil fuel companies. With your unique perspective, do you have any thoughts on that movement?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's kind of a complicated topic. So Bill McKibben, who's an environmental activist and a good friend of mine, and a board member of the TNC chapter in the Adirondacks, he's been an environmentalist for a long time. He was one of the first people to identify climate change as the challenge that it is. And he's very, very frustrated that the kinds of strategies that, for example, the Nature Conservancy advocates for, although he supports them, he says you've had a lot of time and you haven't had the success that you should have had by now. And about that, I'd have to say he's kind of right. And so he says it's now time for more aggressive action. And so he's trying to organize, especially college students, to campaign for colleges, especially those colleges and universities with big endowments, to divest from fossil fuel companies, to kind of raise the ante, build awareness, put pressure on companies, and get something done about greenhouse gases. And what do I think of that strategy? I respect Bill. I think it's not a bad play to get, we would like to see college students more engaged, so maybe it will work there. As an former investment banker, divesting seems to me, in total, doesn't seem to me to be exactly right, because we're not divesting fossil fuels from our lifestyle right now. You know, we all got here. I mean, we're an economy that still depends on oil, et cetera. I'll tell you what the Nature Conservancy has done. I'm proud of us. It's controversial, but I'm the CEO, so I'm responsible for it with the support of my board. We have a pretty big endowment. We have one of the bigger we have the biggest endowment in the world of environmental nonprofits. And so we said, okay, we've got this big endowment. We're an environmental leader. We don't really agree with Bill's strategy of divesting all of these companies on the one hand, but on the other hand, I think we do have some responsibility to get the business community, investors, companies, et cetera, to pay more attention to the climate change topic. So what we've decided to do is we won't any longer invest in a company that gets more than 5% of its revenue from coal or tar sands, nor will we invest in a utility that approves an investment in the U.S. in a new coal plant unless it has carbon capture and sequestration. By the way, about that, everyone says, well, nobody's building coal plants right in the near term now anyway. That's true, but that might not be true for long. So now, why did we come up with this strategy? It's a little bit arbitrary. I'm not going to pound the table and say we've got it exactly right. And we even said, this will be dynamic and we'll see if we can fine-tune this. But I believe from my Wall Street experiences that we've done something significant because Wall Street pays attention to us. We're a reasonably big customer. And so they said, wow, we have to now, look at this. We've got to do something about this. So we've told the folks who manage money for us, they have 1 year to comply. But if they can't assure us, certify us, that their portfolios are free of these stocks, we're not going to let them run money for us anymore. Then, of course, people say, well, boy, you might sacrifice returns if you do so. We might in occasional periods, if there were a period where tar sand stocks or coal stocks suddenly soared in value, perhaps we'll give something up, although we don't anticipate that happening. So we don't think we're really sacrificing much. And there's a dialogue now, just by way of our intervention between money managers and companies that we think is healthy and constructive. But why not just divest all those stocks? Because we think some of the stocks that McKibben thinks we should divest, they're the companies who we need to work with, kind of like we're working with Dow. Take Duke Energy. Duke Energy, the Southern utility, it's one of the biggest carbon emitters in the country, you could say. So bad guy on the one hand. On the other hand, I say also good guy, because they're also one of the biggest investors in renewable energy and transmission lines for renewable energy, which we also need. So I'm wary of the vilification approach. I want to get the big tent and get more people helping us on the one hand. On the other hand, we do think as an investor we should get people to pay some attention here. So that's why we've adopted our strategy.
Thank you.
Yes?
I'd imagine that when you work in, let's say, Brazil with sugarcane growers or in Ecuador with city officials, you come up with a solution, complete your project, but at the time when the project finishes or the funding runs out, your staff goes with you, and correct me if I'm wrong. But the question I have is, how do you make sure that, or how do you kind of encourage the transfer of the skills and the principles that were used to come up with these groundbreaking decisions or solutions? How do you encourage those same principles to be used by the locals when you leave?
Yeah, that's the heart of what we do in these countries. So I hope even in my examples about the water funds, you'll see that, in that Quito water fund story, they don't really need us anymore. Everybody knows what they're doing. And by the way, we didn't do that all by ourselves. I'm in a speech, I have to be quick. In the book, I'm clear. In every project we do, we've got a whole host of partners. And in our non-U.S. jurisdictions, of course, it includes those local partners. But the whole name of the game is design projects that will sustain and endure and also be replicated. So we try to do everything we can to design our projects that way. Do we always succeed? Of course not, because whenever you try to do something difficult, you're not always going to get it right. But all we're about is trying to initiate practices that will sustain and endure and be replicated so that we'll have the biggest impact that we possibly can. Okay? Thanks. Yes?
Hello. I'm just a recent graduate from Ohio State and had a few questions about diversifying between developing countries versus developed. I know you mentioned you have a lot of efforts going on in developing countries, and through research and everything at Ohio State, we've often found that the developing countries are often vilified as shame on you, you're degrading the environment, when in fact the U.S. is using 30% of the natural resources, and it's mostly outsourcing pollution. So I guess my question is, like, what are we doing, or what is the Nature Conservancy and all other nature organizations doing in the U.S. to, like, raise the awareness that, you know, we do contribute to China's growing pollution and that stuff worldwide?
I mean, thank you for mentioning that. So sometimes people say, I mean, you hear it all sorts of ways. You hear some people say population growth is the biggest environmental challenge. Population growth is a challenge, to be sure, and we'd be better off with less population growth than more. But most of the world's population growth is happening in very poor countries where those new people have incredibly small environmental footprints. The real environmental damage is being done by rich countries and rich people like us. That's one way to think about it. Another place that always comes up is in climate change, because China now has overtaken us as an annual emitter of greenhouse gases. It's true, they have finally overtaken us, but on a per capita basis, we're light years ahead of them. And on a cumulative basis, you know, they've just begun. So there are all sorts of questions of morality and fairness here. We're not an organization, we try not to vilify anyone. We certainly don't criticize our partners in the developing world. I remember visiting Brazil with my youngest son. Now he's a sophomore in high school, but this was 4 or 5 years ago, so he's like a 6th grader. And we were talking about our efforts to protect the Amazon. And Brazil actually has very forward legislation here, where in different parts of Brazil, a farm is required to set aside 1/3 to more than half of their land as pristine forests. Anyway, there was some debate among environmentalists about whether that was enough, and my young son, Rex, was smart enough to observe that's a hell of a lot more than you see set aside when you go on an airplane trip across America, where we've set nothing aside. Environmentalists should be humble for a whole bunch of reasons. Environmentalists from the West and the developed world should be especially humbly. However, in our defense, we didn't know as much about nature as we do today. We didn't know that, you know, the dependence we were building up on fossil fuels would have the harm we do. So we mostly try to stay away from the blame game and get everybody on the same page as much as possible to make good progress. Thanks.
Thank you.
We're running out of time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mark, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, Mark, thank you very much. I'm worried that Amazon is going to be swamped now for calls for your book, and we'll look forward to reading it. Let me just thank you all for coming, and let me encourage you to come to our next series of speech. Don Berwick is our next speaker. Don was formerly head of Medicare and Medicaid and is a founder of the Institute for Health Improvement and is currently running for governor in Massachusetts. A very interesting thought leader in healthcare in the United States right now. Michael Govan is head of LACMA, which is Contemporary Art Museum in Los Angeles. A real art historian, and he will be here in March. Norman Foster, the architect from Foster & Partners in London, one of the great architectural firms in the world, and the architect for our new medical school complex, will be here later in the spring at a date yet to be determined. So I invite you all to come back. I hope we'll see you again soon, and thank you very much, and travel safely.